CO2 and gas diffusion. This presentation was developed by Dr. Thierry Kubota from the University of Arizona. The content of this presentation includes composition of air, understanding photosynthesis as gas diffusion to chloroplasts, and typical response to CO2 concentration in a greenhouse. This slide shows the composition of dry air. Nitrogen concentration is usually around 79%, oxygen 21%. CO2 concentration varies a lot depending on the location and then also the levels of human-related activities around the measurement site. But the normal concentration is more or less 400 parts per million. Or in percent unit, it is 0.040%. And parts per million is the same as micromole per mole, which is the unit utilized in scientific journals and scientific reports. And some other gases, minor gases, are included in the dry air. So speaking about the unit, percent, ppm, micromole per mole, or Pascal, are the units used for gas concentration. So here is the unit conversion as a reference, and 1% equal to 10,000 parts per million, and that's the same as micromole per mole. So this is 10,000 micromole per mole, and kilopascal is depending on the total pressure, but under 101 kilopascal atmospheric pressure, then 1% is 1.0 kilopascal. So photosynthesis is the process requires CO2, and the site of photosynthesis in the plant is chloroplast. So CO2 gas needs to reach this chloroplast, the photosynthetic site. And the entrance for CO2 gas is called stomata. This is the opening distributed over the plant surface, particularly in the leaves. The size of opening is 10 micrometer order, but plant leaves have many of those to let the CO2 in and oxygen out, and then also moisture out from this opening. So because of the CO2 travels into the chloroplast passively rather than actively, we can consider this as diffusion. But because this is diffusion, the CO2 concentration between the air and then also chloroplast is the driving force of this diffusion. Therefore, when you have a large difference between CO2 concentration in the air and CO2 concentration in the chloroplast, then you have greater photosynthetic rate, diffusion rate is occurring. And again, the concentration gradient is the driving force of photosynthesis. CO2 concentration and photosynthesis is in a proportional relationship. And in the pathway of diffusion, there are two measurable major resistances involved. So this diagram is showing the diffusion with the two resistances. One is the boundary layer resistance, which is associated with the layer called boundary layer, created above the plants, over the surface of the plants, due to the friction of moving air over the surface of the plants. And that layer thickness is affected by wind and then also size of the plant and surface structure of the plants. And those are affecting the thickness of the layer, therefore the resistance of the boundary layer. Another resistance, stomatal resistance, this is associating with stomatal opening. So wide open stomata are giving the least resistance to the gas diffusion. Or photosynthetic rate is inversely proportional to the total resistance, which is boundary layer resistance plus stomatal resistance. And this slide is showing a typical response of plant leaf to the CO2 concentration. And as you can see, up to 400 to 500 parts per million or micromoles per mole, the plant photosynthetic rate almost increasing linearly and then slowing down and saturate around 1000, 1500 parts per million. So this is because photosynthesis is the diffusion, and then CO2 concentration increase in the air increase the photosynthetic rate. However, some other factors such as light is now limiting, therefore it doesn't increase linearly all the way, including that high concentration range. And that response can be characterized by two parameters. One is CO2 compensation point, the other one is CO2 saturation concentration. Compensation point giving zero net photosynthetic rate, so below that you wouldn't get positive net photosynthetic rate, so the respiration exceeds photosynthetic rate. Typically the concentration of compensation is between 50 to 100 micromoles per mole, and CO2 saturation concentration, which is giving the maximum net photosynthetic rate, is about 1000 to 3000 micromole per mole. So this is also depending on the growing conditions and also depending on the species. This diagram or chart is showing the relationship between net photosynthetic rate and CO2 concentration and irradiance. In one of earlier presentations, we discussed how PAR is affecting net photosynthetic rate. So increasing PAR or irradiance, light intensity, increase the photosynthetic rate under the same CO2 concentration. And by increasing CO2 concentration, then you can increase further the net photosynthetic rate at a given PAR, irradiance, light intensity. And this relationship is very important for conducting CO2 enrichment in the greenhouse, particularly during winter time when irradiance is not enough to support plant productivity. Alternative way to enhance photosynthesis is CO2 enrichment, increasing CO2 in the atmosphere inside the plant production system. So when plants are growing under high CO2 concentration, you will see acclimation to that high CO2 concentration. So the effect of high CO2 concentration to the plant photosynthesis wouldn't disappear, but magnitude of increase compared to low CO2 concentration or the photosynthesis or growth under low CO2 concentration would become smaller. Because of this acclimation process. The instantaneous acclimation could be observed as the change in stomatal opening. So the resistance would increase, stomatal resistance would increase under high CO2 concentration. And another one is plants can reduce the number of stomata or reduce the size of stomata when plants are growing under high CO2 concentration. And then another phenomenon we know is downregulation of photosynthesis. So the enzyme rubisco may not as highly functional as it was under lower CO2 concentration conditions because of the downregulation coming from accumulated sugar concentration in the leaf. So this final slide is summarizing reported values of yield increase of 3 different crops under high CO2 concentration. The increase seems to be very different between mature plants and then also immature plants or vegetative plants. Vegetative plants or immature plants tend to have bigger response than mature plants, and that is probably associated with downregulation and acclimation. to the high CO2 concentration. And then also, depending on the crop, the yield increase is very different. Lettuce seems to be higher than tomato, and typical tomato yield increase under high concentration is, in this case, harvestable fruit mass increase is between 14 to 20% out of 131 papers found by this author. Thank you very much for listening.